it was not her dream to become an art student or a design student, but it was somehow a suggestion of a friend of Yamawaki Iwao that Michiko got the chance to study at the Bauhaus. Was kind of a thought experiment, which turned out to be a real experiment. I'm Mariko Takagi. I'm half German, half Japanese, and currently living in Kyoto and teaching there graphic design, book design, and typography.
The event that seemed to be kind of the biggest expose for the Yamawakis was what they called Orientalisches Fest. The Yamawakis seem to be in charge. Michiko is wearing kimono. She was surprised how natural it felt to wear it at the Bauhaus and how people responded to it. Yamawaki Iwao wrote a kind of calligraphic backdrop for the stage or for the party. My name is Helena Čapková. I am a researcher and teacher at University in Kyoto in Japan.
My name is Anja Guttenberger, and this is my podcast, Bauhaus Faces. Welcome to a new episode of Bauhaus Faces. I'm Anja, your host. My voice is a little deeper and hoarse today. I'm really sorry about that. I have a little cold. But I really wanted to get this episode to you, because today's episode is dedicated to a Japanese couple who went all the way to Germany to study at the Bauhaus in Dessau, Iwao and Michiko Yamawaki. When they met each other in 1928, Iwao Fujita had already studied architecture in Tokyo and was also very actively involved in the theater scene there. Michiko came from a very wealthy family and was a culturally educated young woman of 18 years, 12 years younger than Iwao. By marrying into the Yamawaki family, Iwao immensely profited from their wealth. He happily took on Michiko's family name in exchange for a world trip for that one final destination, the Bauhaus in Dessau. In July of 1930, the Yamawakis left Japan, stayed for some time in New York, and then went on to Berlin and Dessau. After the preliminary course, the Vorkurs, Michiko decided, due to her interest in fashion, to go into the weaving workshop. Iwao, though an already formed architect, chose to continue in the photo class and not in the architecture class. He developed a special interest in photo montages. One of them, entitled The Attack on the Bauhaus, became the visual epitome of the forced closure of the Bauhaus by the Nazis and is today often used as an illustration of that dark last period of the Bauhaus. These 2 years at the Bauhaus shaped the future of the Yamawakis sustainably. Upon returning to Japan in 1932, they became pivotal figures in introducing Bauhaus principles to their home country, and Michiko even became a real stellar figure. They brought back a vast collection of Bauhaus objects, books and furniture, creating a Bauhaus-inspired ambience in their Tokyo home. And they both taught at art schools using the Bauhaus principles of Josef Albers Vorkurs. On this episode, not one, but two great researchers will help me tell the story of Michiko and Iwao Yamawaki, Helena Čapková and Mariko Takagi. And here's a special shout out to Annika Takagi, who allowed me to use her wonderful illustrations of the Yamawakis. Thank you to all of you. Just very briefly, a request on my own behalf. Please subscribe to and rate Bauhaus Faces wherever you are listening, and recommend this podcast to your friends, colleagues and family. So, let's now dive into a new episode of Bauhaus Faces and shine a light on Michiko and Iwao Yamawaki.
Michiko Yamawaki was a daughter from a very rich family. So originally from Osaka, they had a sake brewery and owned land. And so Michiko's father was building up the business in Tokyo. But at the time, Michiko was a young woman, the brewery didn't exist anymore. And the father was mainly a landlord and businessman. But he still had time for a lot of hobbies, doing, for example, tea ceremonies, but being also very interested in craft and not only collecting, for example, ceramics and lacquer, but he also made things by himself. So he was always very active, I think, and very, very interested not only in traditional art and craft, but also in international art and craft. And yeah, he was a very mundane man, I would say. Michiko, for the time when she grew up, she was the eldest daughter of this family, but having 7 siblings. And because she was the oldest, like she also had some responsibilities. She became the head of the branch family because, yeah, her uncle, he passed away when she was just 10 years old, and she had to become then the head. It's more symbolic, I would say, but she was then the representative of that family branch. So she had already quite a tight schedule or responsibilities as well, and going to school until she became 18. So, and I think like for the generation of her, this was already quite good because a lot of women didn't had the chance to get so much education. But as she was the first girl in the family, and it was important to have a continuous line of this family, she needed to get married to a man like who was also allowing or accepting that he will take her name. So this is a very traditional system in Japan and nothing rare. But she already did her first photography for this kind of finding the perfect partner when she was 16. So I think these kind of things or detail explain quite well her life. So she got to be prepared since that age on. So meaning like not only going to school, but after school, she studied piano and also getting introduced like to different art skills, like for example, also the tea ceremony. So I think she got an education for that status of this family and also like for her time, which was quite a high standard, preparing her to become an educated, good wife and good mother. This leads also later on how she not always took the chance at the Bauhaus.
Then we have her future husband, who was originally from Nagasaki, so from south of Japan. And he was very active. He was graduate from Geidai, from the Academy of Fine Arts Architecture Department, which is still active, and it has a very long history. There is lots of pride to being graduate from that department. And actually the Bauhaus legacy also is related to it because Fujita graduated from it much earlier, but another and arguably maybe even much more important Japanese student at the Bauhaus, Mitsutani Takehiko, for whom unfortunately we don't have any archive because he burned everything. It's extremely sad, really. He taught for many years at Tokyo Geidai and in the Bauhaus way. And this is kind of legacy that I think we need to highlight later, that this is also what the Yamawakis did in the post-war, and by post-war I mean 50s, 60s, 70s. But Yamawaki, Michiko, and Iwao, they taught at Nihon Daigaku, which is another big university, also with a very well-developed architecture and design departments. So yeah, that's where he studied, Tokyo Academy of Fine Arts, Tokyo Geidai. And he was incredibly active in avant-garde circles, already encountering people that later became his friends or their friends in Berlin. People like Senda Korea mentioned him. Of course, then he would finish his studies, so he would become full-fledged architect. He would enter competitions. He would be also very much involved in the theater, avant-garde theater. So ultimately, although there were some other groups that he was member of, but he joined a significant theater group, Tsukiji Shogekijo, which really was a concentrated avant-garde activity in Tokyo of the time, actually quite successfully staged contemporary German or European theater. So it's a theater of the non-Japanese kind with a progressive stage design and so on. So he was part of all that. I don't think we have information about his motivations, why he did that, but he did join a very formal, yet at the time quite normal, and still actually in Japan existent formal introduction system, Omiyai system. Basically, it's a matchmaking system. Through matchmaker, he saw a photograph, that's how it's done, isn't it? That you saw a portfolio of photographs, and in that one, and we have that photograph that Michiko used. On that occasion, he was introduced to Yamawaki Michiko. This was a major, and probably that's what he kind of wanted to do, marry a wealthy, and in this case also very beautiful, but mainly, that kind of person. And he sort of capitalized on that match. So the compromise he had to do to become a husband of Yamawaki Michiko is to enter the family. Yeah. So what it means is that Japan has very ancient registration system for families and also marriages. And so he would kind of lose or give up his surname, his place in the registration system, and enter the house of the Yamawakis. And also he took the name. And because he did that, he requested the family to finance and support that rather extravagant, what it became, trip to Europe, 2 years a stay. And he was determined to enter and spend some time at the Bauhaus and get that experience.
Before we dive into the great journey of the Yamawakis from Japan to Germany, I asked Mariko and Helena to explain the political and social circumstances that Japan was in at that time and how they got to know, the Yamawakis, how they got to know about the Bauhaus. At least those were the questions that immediately popped up in my mind, and I needed them to be answered to understand the whole situation. So if you don't need that, you can skip this chapter, and we meet again a little later on when Michiko and Iwao set off by luxury ship.
So Japan was closed for more than 200 years. Like, to be very precise, it was maybe around 220 years. And it was a self-chosen, maybe closure, I would say, because in the 17th century, there were missionaries coming to Japan, and they were bringing Christianity to Japan. And there were, people really getting really, really interested into it. But at the same time, it was very critical for the regime to keep the control. So in the 17th century, like around 1630s, there were the first approaches to close the country. And it's quite easy because Japan is surrounded by sea. So between the 1630s and 1853, there was only one port at Dejima for the trades and for certain import and export activities between Japan and the Netherlands and China. So really extremely restricted under strict rules. But Japan had, during that time of 220 years, a certain flow of people coming in and out, but only to this designated port. And it was 1853 when a black ship arrived. And this was the order by America to rush Japan to open for trade. So at that time, there was already realization that they can't keep the ports closed and can't keep this closure, because they saw that the world is evolving, it's changing, technology is getting forward and faster, and also knowledge changes and so on. There is also a lot of trading between different countries, colonialism. So all that they know about. And so they decided, okay, it's time to open the country. So there was this pressure from outside, but at the same time, they had already the mindset, or to say, maybe they knew that they have to open the country, or otherwise they would be the next country to be colonized. So a lot of things happened from there on. So the complete system changed. The top of the country became the Tenno, the emperor again. and moved from Kyoto to Edo, and Edo was renamed to Tokyo. And then they had to catch up more than 200 years of technology, knowledge, and politics, and so on, language. So they sent out a lot of young people to study abroad. And at the same time, they invited scholars to come to Japan and teach like different areas. So that was mainly like the 19th century, like the second part of the 19th century, where Japan tried to cover all the development of the rest of the world of 200 years within like only 50 years or maybe 40 years, I would say. So this was a huge change and a lot of like studying, learning, and everything was changing in an extreme speed. So that was what happened before Bauhaus came along.
Politics, 1920s and 1930s Japan, there is a phenomenon that exists, the kind of first half of 1920s, which is called Taisho democracy. And then from mid-1920s onwards, the era that is called Showa starts. Well, certainly Japan was attempting and performing to adopt democracy and to be more and more increasingly and ultimately, of course, democratic country. But the truth is that still in the 20s and 30s, Japan is a place of an incredibly strong censorship and rather of police-controlled society. Yeah, so it was actually quite challenging to express individual opinion that differed significantly from the kind of consensus or general government-promoted opinion. We know it also from art history or design architecture history because the kind of first avant-garde movement that we like to label as such is a group that is called MAVO. And MAVO really starts in 1923, but the kind of breakthrough and literal sort of breaking point is the Great Kanto earthquake of the 1st of September 1923, where really the Tokyo is destroyed. And for many artists, not only MAVO group, but for other people, it's a, of course, point of horror, but also point of great artistic inspiration and for architects as well, etc. And what is maybe interesting for us is that the leader of MAVO, Murayama Tomoyoshi, fascinating guy, what he shares with Yamawaki that he also spends a year in Berlin and he travels. So he's in Germany, but yeah, he's there in 1922. So much earlier than the Yamawakis. But he also has this history of having this stay. It is absolutely fascinating how all these people, Murayama also, he's very young when he is in Berlin, as I said, in 22, and then we have the Nakada and few others, and architects like Kurata, Chikatada, and yeah, there are, I couldn't say many, but there are definitely, quite a few people like that. And they are different kind of, maybe I can say patterns, because it is a bit repetitive. Some, like Murayama, they kind of want to study and they travel. Yeah, they would go to Stuttgart, then with Bauhaus, they would go to Dessau, Weimar, or something like that. But then we have the whole big bunch. They are usually already graduated, so they're like practicing architects. And they would take a year or a few months. They would kind of travel around Europe. And many, there would be great fascination. And we know, Germany, of course, for the time, it was a magnet for avant-garde artists. So definitely that would be, if not the center, it would be definitely on their passage. And they would go to Paris, they would go to also Czechoslovakia, Brno, Prague, or both. There was also a classical interest, of course, so they would travel to Italy or Greece or any sort of antiquity architecture. And then many of these people, they would be sending stuff back. They would know the editors of a few major publications, and they would send them stuff like little reports from here and there. sometimes, of course, that was already arranged beforehand, that they said that they will meet so-and-so and so-and-so, and there would be like interviews published with major architects. Also, they would know like exhibitions, so they would report from certain exhibition. Then the theater would be a great part of it. As we know, like the architecture, design, theater at this time was super interconnected. So there would be kind of reviews of shows, performances. They saw photographs, also stage design, etc. So the publication activity was huge. And then after they returned back home, they would also often publish a book or a few books.
I think it was at that time also the way how people with a certain status can travel from Japan to Europe. And it took, of course, a long, long time. So nowadays you take the plane and within 12 hours, right? You can travel between Tokyo and Germany. But at that time it took with the ship like 2 months. And many things had to be done by ship, but maybe also some of the road you have to do by train then. And they took first in Yokohama a luxury liner. So a real, I imagine a little bit like Titanic, I would say. So where you have everything on board. You can just party there, but you can also do your exercise there. You can be just on your own. So it's kind of living or moving city. So this is the way how I imagined it when I read different documents. So first they took that ship, Asamaru was the name, from Yokohama to Hawaii, from Hawaii to San Francisco, and then through Yosemite and Chicago to New York. And I think that they informed themselves quite well, or I think Iwao did this before they started, because they read all the traveling journals of other people. And they recommend like, oh, New York, you have to go there. You have to see that. You have to see this exhibition or that museum, and you have to go there shopping and so on. So what I found like while researching about it is like we always think nowadays, like we have so many information and it's so easy to access. But at that time, people had also a quite great like way of interchanging like those kind of information. And sometimes this was through articles, but they had extremely well networks. Like if somebody went to Europe, then people will visit those people, even if they haven't met them before, and just listening to them, like what they experienced, which route they took. And I think like this kind of giving advice or also communication was quite good already at that time. Although, of course, maybe not so convenient as we have it today, but they interchanged quite a lot of those information. And I can imagine as well that Iwao wanted to show Michiko a little bit like the world. So this is my interpretation of the route and also why they made a stop in New York. And from Michiko's writing, you can somehow also guess or understand that she was extremely interested in fashion. So when she got on the liner, she was already completely styled up by her father. Like the father let tailors make her beautiful dresses and beautiful new clothings appropriate for the Europe standard, what he thought in Yokohama. But then, seeing what people and what women were already in New York, she changed her style there and also cut her hair and these kind of things, like somehow trying to find out how she wants to appear in front of other people. And there was also a very nice anecdote that she went to a men's tailor and got there a suit just for herself, and later on being extremely admired by people on the street, like asking her, like, where do you got this? And so on.
It was kind of a honeymoon trip, yes. So in 1930, they go and they have this kind of glamorous around the world trip, and they are arriving then to Berlin and finding a flat in Dessau and ultimately reaching there. So it is kind of something like of Great Gatsby story. the 2 years that they spent in Germany studying, they do have the support, the finances. So they sort of always travel between Berlin and Dessau, and the weekend in Berlin is kind of the idea for them. And they would see many theater performances, and they would go to different restaurants and bars, etc. And they would have their network. And there was, by the 1930s for sure, quite a vibrant network and just a group of Japanese residing in Germany at the time. Yeah, I was thinking about Berlin. There seems to be quite a lot of Japanese restaurants and cafes, and will be some regular publications in Japanese for this community. And Yamawaki's friends, the most known figure that Yamawaki was related to was a guy called Senda Korea. His name was actually different. He was called Ito Kumyo, but Senda Korea was his pseudonym that he was using, and he became very well known also after the war as an actor, mostly in Japan. He was super active also in publishing. He would be publishing reports from what's going on. He was quite well connected, and actually he was helping Yamawaki also. It's said that he was the one helping them to find a flat in Dessau and kind of help them to settle down. The event that seemed to be kind of the biggest expose for the Yamawakis was what they called Orientalisches Fest, one of the legendary festivals at the Bauhaus-Dessau, which had this Oriental topic. And there was, the Yamawakis seemed to be in charge, so they are talking about it. And Michiko is wearing kimono, which, there is very interesting narrative about this, like how she wasn't particular. She was used to wearing kimono, again, because of her father's tea ceremony practice. But for the woman like her, it would be pretty common to wear Western clothing, in Japan as well. So she also herself saw wearing kimono as something quite special and, unusual. But she was surprised how natural it felt to wear it at the Bauhaus and how people responded to it. They did talk about kimono as a kind of perfect outfit. So that was kind of confirmed by her experience. And then there was, for example, another component of this Oriental festival that we know. It is definitely recorded as it happened. It's just, unfortunately, I never managed to find a lot of detailed information about it. But Yamawaki Iwao says that he wrote a kind of calligraphic backdrop for the stage or for the party. And that calligraphy was liked by Paul Klee. Definitely Michiko Yamawaki and Iwao, maybe much more than when they were at the Bauhaus, because I think they were, this Orientalisches Fest and that kind of thing was probably successful, and there was an interest in them, but it was still a bit Orientalist, They were kind of interesting, like intriguing people. They had some friends, like among classmates. At the same time, I wouldn't say that they were super popular. And Michiko certainly notes that there was probably not only the Orientalism, which we could kind of expect, but the fact that they were so wealthy, and obviously they could have quite a glamorous lifestyle, and Michiko dressed, quite, it was quite something. That also probably didn't help. Yeah, so they were seen as a bit of the elite kind of exotic couple. They did go through Vorkurs, both of them. That was quite extraordinary for Michiko. I don't think she felt totally as a kind of victim in a sense, but she made a choice. But she certainly portrays herself as like tabula rasa, like somebody who never done anything before. And then, she was put into this amazing situation. And the fact that she succeeded, in fact, ultimately, meaning she went through the Vorkurs. There is always this kind of, the husband Iwao helped me,
So she did her work well. And also in the book written by Kawahata Naomichi, you can see some of the pictures of her work and they look very good. So it looks very nicely done. And also the exercises in typography, the lettering and so on looks also very good. Yeah, but then Iwao said she only passed because she's very skillful, like not talented, but skillful, as any Japanese are, saying it is a culture thing. And if you are a Japanese, you are very good to craft things and to work precise and so on. And I found this demoralizing as a woman, especially. But I can read from these kind of words also kind of competition. I'm not so 100% sure because I couldn't meet both of them, but it was also like in his letters that he sent to Japan as a kind of report. But this is a kind of stereotype, I think, which is built up a long, long time ago. And also that Michiko got the chance like to study at the Bauhaus was a kind of a thought experiment, which turned out to be a real experiment.
That's another issue that comes to mind. And that is a language issue because it seemed that the Yamawakis struggled with understanding. Michiko noted this during the preparatory course, the Vorkurs. So they really appreciated that Albers and, he has mentioned that they would try maybe in English or somehow explain more to Michiko and Iwao what they were discussing in the classes.
There's a document which says after passing first classes and getting like in the second semester, there was a note saying, yeah, you have to improve your German to be able to follow the teaching and follow the instructions. So I can imagine like the communication part was the most difficult part. Nakada Sadanosuke, his partner, she was an artist. So he proposed to Iwao it would be interesting to let Michiko study as well. And maybe she was doing it too good. She was too much engaged into those kind of subjects and suddenly getting maybe too ambitious, like to do the homeworks. So I can imagine like there was also this kind of competition among the two without really naming it or without really saying it, because it is still a very patriarchal system in Japan where the man is the genius and the woman is the muse or maybe like just very skillful. And I think like this pattern is still going on. And I saw it also in this letter. And about the weaving workshop, she mentions that she was very interested in photography. And I saw also like in the book, there are also some photographic work, but I would say I like more her collages. She was doing beautiful collages. But I can imagine like this was also one area she shouldn't get in because Iwao was already taking photos. So this could be very hard. In her training in Japan, I think she learned to work with textile and so on. So because she got this training, typical training for a young woman, which includes, of course, you have to do your own sewing of clothes and so on. So this was part of her education. And I think also based on this, weaving was the closest area and also the area where she felt secure as a woman. So I can imagine that there were also these kind of very stereotypical patterns between a man's role and a woman's role in society. I think it must have been a real strong contrast between this Japanese life that she had, which was also very special for Japan at that time. So not everyone was so gifted. Even before going to Germany, she could eat ice cream with her father, which was luxury. So yeah, she grew up in this like circle and I think being extremely protected as well. So I can imagine that going abroad and then suddenly finding herself in a completely different environment could have been like a quite big challenge. there's a document which says after passing first classes and getting like in the second semester, there was a note saying, yeah, you have to improve your German to be able to follow the teaching and follow the instructions. So I can imagine like the communication part was the most difficult part. If you imagine this very young woman and maybe also not very good in communicating in German, completely taken out of cultural context and suddenly being in a workshop where everyone should like work on their own and maybe be self-responsible what they do and what they create and so on. And independent, of course. Like, I think this was quite huge. Like, this was an experience that she never done before. So I can imagine this was very hard for her. And she wrote also that Gunther Stolzel wasn't this kind of like very stressful time because she knew already like she can't stay there. And I think Gunther Stolzel at that time was also bullied, in a way, like bullied out of the weaving workshop. And so Michiko mentions a lot Otti Berger and Annie Albers, who helped her a lot. And Otti Berger as a friend, and Annie Albers, who was extremely welcoming and supporting her. Yeah, there were 2 designs where she was doing some sketches for rugs. And they are very geometrical, I would say, and almost line drawing. Because I couldn't use the photographic materials in the book, so I did line drawings, so to show like the pattern. And yeah, especially while transforming those shapes into line drawing, I found out that they have quite a lot of similarities with patterns of kimonos. And so that there are somehow more coming like from these maybe also masculine patterns of some kimono fabrics. And they look maybe at the beginning quite hard and traditional if you put it on a kimono, but then if you see it as a rug or tapestry, they look very modern because they are extremely abstract as well. And I found it's quite fine and sensitive. And also the use of color. So different shades of dark blue. Translated to like graphic design speaking, it would be using cyan and black, but not including a lot of magenta. So it's not this blue with a strong red inside, but more indigo. So, and there's also indigo dyeing in Japan. So I can imagine that she translated also what she saw through like the education of her father into the pattern she created then at the Bauhaus. I would say for the 2 sketches, for rugs, I would say, yeah, I can see this in it. But then also like she made later on quite pictorial things. So like one work, she worked on like 2 years on one rug, like which went also later on into an exhibition at the Royal Academy. This was a work where she did a self-portrait with a cat and a loom. And there I saw a certain connection like to a work that she has done at the Bauhaus, where she made a very geometrical pattern for a man with a dog. The one she did at the Bauhaus is quite geometrical, while the one she did later on in Japan is a little bit more like an illustration on a rug, I would say.
Michiko Yamawaki, as an artist or as a weaver, probably doesn't stand comparison, with the amazing weavers and artists that we know from the Bauhaus Textile Workshop. She just, didn't, to say it maybe diplomatically and simply, she didn't produce any work that I could put on the same level. There are some works that are talked about. I saw reproductions of some, and I also don't think that the artistic value is so great. But and these are works that she submitted to different exhibitions and that were actually exhibited at the large kind of salon type of exhibitions that were happening in Tokyo at the time. It's called Daytime. And one of these is called The Loom and the Cat. And it's really quite what it is. It was large, I think 3 meters to 1.5 meter kind of tapestry. It is interesting that Iwao, who is also going through this path, but he has a portfolio. He can show his kind of easier or, I don't know, more straightforward or obvious sort of success in terms of the pathway through the Bauhaus in Dessau. He is not, and that's maybe even not surprising. I mean, he's already an architect, right? So he wasn't interested in doing architecture. He was passionate about photography, theater. He was working with Peterhans, and then he was absolutely kind of fashioned himself into a missionary for photomontage. He was really keen on mastering that technique and kind of promoting it in Japan as a kind of important for promoting ideas and, of course, products too. So this is where he was. He wasn't in the architecture department or workshop. So that's quite maybe unexpected. Yeah. And then, as I said, every weekend or so, it would be in Berlin and reviewing the theater life, which was also something very much compelling for Iwao, I would say, much more than for Michiko.
Iwao Yamawaki first wanted to join the architecture class, but when he realized that the teaching content was mostly directed toward new students, he took the photography class instead. The Bauhaus photo class was opened in 1929 and headed by the Berlin-based photographer Walter Peterhans. He taught at the Bauhaus until the end of it in 1933 and emigrated to the US in 1938. Here, he worked as a professor at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago until his death in 1960. It was Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, the third director of the Bauhaus, who took over the directorship of the IIT in 1938 and recruited Peterhans. They, of course, had known each other from the Bauhaus, where Mies was the director from 1930 to 1933. The next episode of Bauhaus Faces, by the way, will be about Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, so don't forget to tune in next time too. Anyway, Iwao Yamawaki studied at the photo class with Walter Peterhans. From his photos, one can deduct that Peterhans's perfectionism in positioning and illuminating still lifes transferred to Yamawaki's aesthetic. A close-up of a red cabbage cut in half becomes a meandering sea delta with multiple arms in his photo. The double exposure of a Bauhaus lamp makes its movable arm visible. Karl Lagerfeld, who was a world-known German fashion designer and passionate photographer himself, was a great admirer of Iwao Yamawaki's photos, and he collected them. In 1999, Lagerfeld published a big square book with a semi-transparent cover featuring a photo of bubbles by Yamawaki. The motifs of the 62 photos range from views of the Bauhaus building in Dessau and other modern architecture, to photos of Bauhaus design products, and on to portraits of people and details of objects. All produced in their original size and printed on thick matte paper. I came across this book a few years ago and had to have it. It's a really nice piece of my collection of books about Bauhaus artists. Even though Iwao Yamawaki studied at the Bauhaus photo class and actively took photos on the road trip, on his return to Japan, he turned away from photography. Through his friend Kurt Kranz, who was a member of the advertising workshop at the Bauhaus, Iwao Yamawaki got in touch with the photomontage. By reading the leftist newspaper AIZ, Arbeiter Illustrierte Zeitung, that regularly circulated at the Bauhaus, Yamawaki also got in touch with the political photomontages of John Hartfield, who at that time designed the covers. Iwao produced a couple of photomontages himself, and one is especially interesting and became a crucial piece of historical documentation for the last days of the Bauhaus in Dessau, entitled Der Schlag gegen das Bauhaus, The Attack on the Bauhaus.
So the attack on the Bauhaus was produced before the Yamawakis leave, so in 1932. And it is a rather small format, I think near a postcard, but a bit bigger, but small work. And it is often characterized as a kind of a vision or a kind of premonition of the end of the Bauhaus, really, because what you see in that photo montage is a combination of the Yamawakis photographs that he took at the Bauhaus of students and the Bauhaus-Dessau buildings, the fragments of that, and cutouts from newspapers of the contemporary German politicians and also the representatives of the Nazi party. And basically the composition and the dynamic between these personages of power vis-a-vis the students is arranged again. It has quite a typical kind of diagonal, two diagonals kind of composition. The feeling is that, that these people of power are going to attack, and this kind of free-spirited, because you see in that work, the Bauhaus students entertaining themselves, that will be the end of it. So that is the kind of atmosphere and the message of that work, which was also immediately published in Kokusei Kenchiku, September 1932 in Japan. So it is a very interesting and kind of a puzzling work, really. I mean, this collage is iconic because what I've tried to say, this kind of really the kind of premonition that was in the air, what is going to happen ultimately. He perceived it. And of course, then it's so powerful from retrospect.
Bauhaus was closed in Dessau by the Nazis. So at that point, one thing was, of course, it was very insecure what will happen after and whether Bauhaus will reopen in Berlin or not, and whether they can continue the way they did before. At the same time, Michiko needed to be back in Japan in December 1932 for a family ceremony, and therefore it was just the right timing to head back. But if you just look into most of Japanese people staying around that time in Europe or in Germany, most of them stayed longest for 2 years and then went back. So I think maybe it was quite a regular turn, to say, okay, after 2 years, we saw this place, we learned a lot, and then we go back to then teach maybe in Japan, or maybe then start there the new life. And in fact, before they left Germany, they still bought quite a lot of different products, or they also exchanged work with Bauhaus artists and Bauhaus students. They were building up in that time a certain archive of their own and taking everything back, going to Japan. So I think maybe this was also the time they allowed themselves to stay in Germany.
Apparently, Michiko, her family, they bought a lot of furniture, some metalwork. She imported a number of looms for her textile making. So actually she transported via cargo ship, the couple, Yamawakis, quite a bit of Bauhaus back home. And they had these pieces in their apartment. They rented a couple of floors in a very exciting kind of a small tower house in Ginza, even more central in Tokyo. And one part of one of the floors served as Michiko's textile weaving workshop. And there are photographs from that flat and that time. So you can see her in that workshop. So they lived there, and the Bauhaus lived there with them.
It was almost as the press were waiting for Michiko to come back. So a lot of people were curious what she experienced in Germany, how she would dress and so on. So yeah, the press was very open and the media was very interested in her, letting her do interviews and so on. But then also the wife of Nakada Sadanosuke, Nakada Kikuyo, she was an artist and also painter herself. She did an exhibition at the Shiseido Gallery before. She suggested then Michiko to do an exhibition at the Shiseido Gallery. And Shiseido Gallery is very interesting because Shiseido Gallery was one of the first galleries in Japan and Tokyo where they didn't only exhibit art, but also design. So this was a great chance for Michiko, and it was planned that she will do 5 days exhibition, like from the 1st May 1933 until the 5th of May. But because so many people went there, it was extended for 2 days. And some people came even a few times or many times or every day just to see the work again. And it was claimed to be her solo exhibition, but in fact, there were many other materials as well. So, of course, all the sketches and designs and even like some of the real work that she made at the Bauhaus was exhibited, but also Iwao's photography. But interestingly enough, not the photography which Iwao produced as a kind of his artistic work, but rather documentation of the Bauhaus, portraits of people at the Bauhaus, or where you can read the whole atmosphere of the buildings and how it is to study at the Bauhaus. And then, of course, like what they collected and what they exchanged with Bauhaus people.
Let's talk a little bit about the photos that Mariko just mentioned, the ones that Iwao Yamawaki took of the Bauhaus building and the people who studied there. Apart from the still lifes and close-ups of objects that are very much influenced by Walter Peterhans's photo class and that I've talked about earlier in this podcast, these photos are different. Iwao seems to take a much closer look into unimpressive corners rather than looking at the big picture. You probably all know the photos of the Bauhaus building by Lucia Morelli that were used as promotion for the Bauhaus even after it closed, and I'm talking about these photos in detail in another episode of Bauhaus Faces with Robin Schuldenfrei. So if you'd like to go and listen to that episode afterwards too, please do so. But Iwao Yamawaki's photos were nothing like that. Maybe you know this really famous photo of the Bauhaus lettering on the wall of the Bauhaus building, which is doubled by its shadow. Yes, that photo is by Iwao Yamawaki. And there are more photos that focus on lonely corners of the Bauhaus or on lined-up chairs on the Bauhaus terrace. In his portraits of persons and objects, he too tries to find the special view, sometimes using double exposure as in the photo of the lamp that I mentioned earlier, in the same manner as many other photo-savvy Bauhauslers like Telux Feininger and Etelforder Mittag, about whom I already published episodes here on Bauhaus Faces too. He uses extreme perspectives from below and setting the scene in oblique angles. Well, if you are thinking now, I'd like to see those photos myself and not just hear Anja talking about it, I will link the website Mutual Art for you in the show notes. Here you can find 96 works by him, including works from the photo class, individual photos that Iwao took while in Germany, and a few of his collages too. Take a look, it's worth it. Let's now return to Mariko. She will continue to talk about what has come out of the first exhibition of Michiko Yamawaki at the Shiseido Gallery.
I think this was the starting point where she can connect to a lot of different people. And also, I think this opened her the door for doing work for Shiseido, because later on she was, I think, part of the committee for the Shiseido Graph, a magazine by Shiseido, but she also did design for them, a beautiful collage as well. Yeah, so I'm not so sure whether she met there for the first time Kawakita Renshiro, like who also built up a school in Tokyo based on the ideas of Bauhaus. So Kawakita never went to Germany by himself, but he visited all the people like who went to Bauhaus and talked to them and asked for materials and asked to get an insight about this. And he built up in Tokyo a school which he said that it was built on the foundation course of Bauhaus. And so she got in contact with a lot of new people at this exhibition and also got new offers through this exhibition as well. Like, I think this was also the point when she got her first teaching assignments. So Kawakita offered her and also Iwao teaching assignments. And from there on, for 2 semesters, I think she was teaching at the school from Kawakita and teaching weaving. So it brought her a lot of media attention. And also I found a lot of articles. Either she was part of an interview or she was talking with different women about one topic. And I can imagine a lot of things turned out there in this first going public exhibition. I think she wouldn't have had any career, because normally it would be rather that she would support her family, support her husband. This was the role meant for her. But I think because of the chance of getting to Bauhaus and studying there, and everyone wanted to know more about what's going on at the Bauhaus, suddenly she came back and became a kind of superstar. And I think also that she was young and beautiful was even a driver for that. So at least what I got from the information I got hold on, she was much more in the focus of the media than her husband. Of course, he later on got teaching positions and so on. But this fame where everyone wanted to talk with her or get an interview or do some photo shooting, she also did some fashion model job for certain press. So I think this chance came only through Bauhaus.
There are many things that are rather fascinating about Michiko Yamawaki and her course of development as a designer and kind of a player for quite short time. For a few years, she has quite a exposed and quite a stellar kind of designer career, engaging herself in kind of artistic. She just kind of tapestries, which are exhibited at the kind of art shows. But she also was committed to teaching, weaving. She developed this kind of portable small loom that she was using in her classes. She was doing that, but she basically stopped her sort of activity as a designer. She basically, for family reasons, after she had the second child, she sort of became more kind of housewife. And a little bit, I have to say, she blamed it on her husband and restarted the teaching only much later in a post-war, also teaching as her husband at the Nihon University Design Department. There are still today her students around in Japan.
We now got a really good idea about what Michiko Yamawaki did after their return to Japan. But let's take now a look at Iwao Yamawaki's life after the return.
When he was at the Bauhaus, Iwao was rather more into photo montage and photographs, etc. He tried, but wasn't successful really with his photography. Iwao's big project, for example, in 1939 is the murals for the Japanese pavilion at the New York World Fair. And yes, he's engaged in a project that obviously are promoting the Japanese regime at the time, and which is actually even fascist. But Iwao then is very much engaged with the regime, we would say. And he exhibited, but was kind of disappointed. And then he did build a little bit. There are a number of projects by Yamawaki Iwao from the 30s that he executed. In 1934, Iwao Yamawaki designed their own house in Komaba, in central Tokyo. There are a few more houses he designed and built. It's really a few things, but as we know it from Europe and elsewhere, he belonged already before he went to Berlin, but the kind of Berlin experience certainly gave him more currency. So in the 30s, he would be on the radar, like among this kind of a group of architects whose work would be featured again in any significant architecture magazine. And certainly Yamawaki Iwao's houses would appear in these publications. So definitely, regardless of the small number, it would be quite visible what he was doing. Unfortunately, basically, we only have one left to this day, and that is, I will talk about it a little bit, that is a Megishi Kotaro atelier house. Hopefully, it will survive. Recently, the family sold it to the developer that promised to keep it. So let's hope for the best. But yeah, otherwise, we don't have much more left. And yeah, the Megishi Kotaro atelier house is fascinating because it was fascinating collaboration between Iwao Yamawaki and Megishi Kotaro, he died very soon after the house was finished. But he was a very talented and fantastic painter. And he had quite a strong vision of his house. So it was one of those collaborations between architect with vision and artist with vision. But they managed to realize against some about skepticism. And yes, so this is what he was doing. And I mentioned already some project for the government, the pavilion, and then there was some other mural for a big theater that he did. Slowly but surely, the activity was less and less. In the 50s, he still built this theater building for Hayusa Company. The buildings that he built all fit the idea of modernism and architecture that was promoted by the Bauhaus, by, the ideas about the hygienic living, the geometry. By the 60s, as we know, Japan kind of, the generation of Tange Kenzo and the younger architects takes over. And these people who kind of have in this age, in the 60s, kind of baggage of the past, some stop altogether everything, and many of them go and retire, so to speak, to teaching. And this is what happens to Yamawaki Iwao also. So he becomes a full-time teacher and teaches at Nishidai for a few more decades. And that's how people knew him. So that's that for him. And publishes the books that I mentioned. These are published all in the post-war. The last one, I believe, is from the 70s. Definitely lots of research can be done in the Musashino Art University. There is quite a substantial collection of the Yamawakis, including some photographs, but also textile pieces, etc. So that's a very good collection. I think probably the best one when we think about archives. Then also some pieces from this collection, I believe, is in the Misawa Homes Bauhaus collection. That's another private collection owned by a kind of developer furniture company, basically. So that's another important collection. And that's, I think, pretty much it. And then there is the published material that I mentioned already. There seems to be still some parts in family hands, but this is quite obscure and enigmatic. And I don't have much more information about that. But to give to the listeners, maybe other than there is hope that maybe some material that we would like to see might still be somewhere.
Iwao and Michiko Yamawaki are one example of Bauhaus students who spread the Bauhaus idea in Japan. They were not the only Japanese people who studied or visited the Bauhaus, though. Before them, Takehiko Mitsutani studied from 1927 to 1929 at the Bauhaus in Dessau with a scholarship of the Japanese Ministry of Culture. And maybe you know that one photo that is called the smallest and the largest member of the Bauhaus and is published in one of the Bauhaus magazines. And the smallest one, that's Takehiko Mitsutani, and the tallest one, that was Per Bücking. And it's a really funny photo because Per Bücking really seems to be double the size of Takehiko Mitsutani. And then there was Onu Tamae, She experienced the last months of the Bauhaus in Berlin, and some more other Japanese persons visited the Bauhaus, among them the painter and art critic Nakara Sarunasoke, who came to see the Bauhaus in Weimar as early as in 1922. What is special about the Yamawakis is the collection they brought home to Tokyo on their return, which they opened to researchers and exhibitors. For the exhibition Gropius and the Bauhaus, the beginning of modern architecture and design, that opened in Tokyo in 1954, Takiko Mitsutani and the Yamawakis, so the 3 Japanese that studied at the Bauhaus in Dessau, they curated the Bauhaus section, and 90 objects of the Yamawakis collection were shown. It was a great crowd puller, and Isa and Walter Gropius came to the grand opening and stayed for 3 months in Japan. There's also a great collection of photos of that trip in the Walter Gropius estate at the Bauhaus archive. The Yamawakis and the Gropiuses spent some time on the trip too, although Walter Gropius had long left the Bauhaus when Michiko and Iwao studied at the Bauhaus. If you are interested in Isa Gropius, you can find an episode on Bauhaus Faces about her too. An episode about Walter Gropius, though, is on my long list of future episodes. The Bauhaus movement is still hugely popular in Japan today. I will put links to articles about Japan and the Bauhaus and about the Yamawakis in the show notes for you. And finally, just a small book tip. Mariko Takagi published with the Mies van der Rohe House a fabulous book about Michiko Yamawaki in 2019. It is called Yamawaki Michiko, a Japanese Bauhaus story. It is a great read if you want to dive into the lives of Michiko and her husband Iwao, about the cultural circumstances and about their work. Of course, you will find this link in the show notes too. And last but not least, please subscribe to and rate this podcast if you liked it, and recommend it to others that you like. And now, there's nothing left to say, but tune in next time for a new episode of Bauhaus Faces.